The silence of the central plains shattered. It did not break with a sound, but with a sudden blinding fracture of light. At the heart of the valley, the ancient stone stele erupted. A column of golden radiance tore upward, piercing the low-hanging clouds. Eulji Mundeok stood 10 paces away, his hand hovering near the hilt of his blade, his boots rooted in the trembling earth. The light did not flicker, it pulsed. It beat with the heavy, rhythmic cadence of a dying star, expanding and contracting. Across the surface of the stone, characters carved centuries ago began to glow, shifting and rearranging themselves like liquid fire. Eulji stepped closer, the heat searing his skin, his eyes locked onto the glowing script. The symbols burned into his vision. He reached out, his fingers inches from the stone, and felt the vibration of the prophecy rattling his very bones. The message was clear. The era of peace had ended. The golden light flared with renewed violent intensity. The golden light faded, leaving behind a lingering, sharp scent of ash. Eulji Mundeok did not look away from the stone. The prophecy had etched a singular, terrifying reality into his mind. Across the North China Plain, the earth was already shuddering. 1.13 million soldiers. The sheer scale of the number defied comprehension. It was a tide of iron. At the head of this massive host rode Emperor Yang, his ambition driving the formation forward like a blunt, unstoppable hammer. Eulji traced the lines of the prophecy with his gaze, visualizing the columns of infantry stretching beyond the horizon, their banners blotting out the sun. The dust kicked up by their advance would turn the sky to gray, choking the life from the valleys. He saw the formation of the vanguard. This was not a mere raid, it was a systematic eradication. Every step the enemy took brought the end of the world closer. He stood motionless, his mind calculating the reach of that iron tide. The threat was no longer a vision, it was a countdown. Eulji Mundeok turned his back on the stone stele and began the ascent. The path up the Taihang Mountains was steep, littered with loose shale that skittered into the abyss with every heavy step. He climbed until the air thinned, and the world below shrank into a map of muted browns and greens. At the summit, he found a jagged outcrop of rock that overlooked the vast expanse of the northern frontier. He stood still, his chest heaving with the exertion of the climb, and scanned the horizon. To the south, the dust clouds raised by the Sui March were already visible, a low-hanging haze that swallowed the light. He ignored the main road, knowing the enemy would follow the path of least resistance. His eyes tracked the winding ribbon of the landscape until they locked on to the Sarha River. It was a narrow, treacherous vein of water, cutting through the valley floor. He studied the topography, noting the steep ridges that hemmed the river in on both sides. Eulji descended the mountain, the terrain shifting from jagged rock to the trampled mud of the valley floor. He moved with a deliberate, low-profile gait, keeping to the deep shadows cast by the supply wagons. The Sui camp was a sprawling, suffocating maze of canvas and iron. Thousands of soldiers moved in a constant, rhythmic churn. He passed rows of tethered horses, their breath hitching in the cold air, and clusters of men huddled around dying embers. He walked directly through the arteries of the camp, his presence masked by the sheer chaotic density of the army. When a patrol of guards crossed his path, he stepped into the blind spot of a supply stack, his breathing shallow and steady. He wove between the lines of tents, stepping over discarded gear and ignoring the shouts of commanders in the distance. He reached the inner perimeter, where the air grew heavy with the scent of oil and expensive incense. He stood before the command tent. Eulji pushed the heavy canvas flap aside and stepped into the command tent. The interior was a sudden shift from the chaotic noise of the camp to a suffocating, heavy stillness. Maps were spread across a massive central table, weighed down by iron daggers and stone seals. General Eulji Mundeok sat at the head, his head bowed over a scroll. The guards stationed at the corners of the tent lunged forward, their hands flying to their hilts, but they stopped dead. They did not shout, they did not strike. They simply froze, caught in the sudden, absolute gravity of the man who had appeared from nowhere. Eulji did not reach for a weapon. He did not bow. He simply stood, his feet planted firmly on the rug, his gaze fixed directly on the general. Eulji Mundeok paused his quill. The scratching sound ceased. He looked up, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto Eulji. The general's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword, the leather creaking under the pressure. The air in the tent grew thin, charged with the static of an impending collision. Yu's face hardened, his jaw muscles working in a slow, rhythmic pulse. He stared at the intruder, searching for a sign of fear or hesitation, but found only a cold, unblinking focus. The two men held the gaze, the silence stretching. Eulji broke the silence. his voice low and resonant, cutting through the heavy air of the tent. He did not speak with the tremor of a captive, but with the steady, rhythmic cadence of a judge passing sentence. He took a single step forward, his boots thudding against the floorboards, and began to recite 5 characters. 5 sharp, biting strikes against the vanity of the Sui. He spoke of the divine craft of their strategy, mocking the depth of their planning, and then twisted the words to highlight the sheer hollow arrogance of their march. He paused between each character, letting the meaning settle into the dust of the tent. He spoke of the water, the mountains, and the inevitable hunger that would soon claim the thousands waiting outside. His tone was not loud, yet it carried the weight of a collapsing wall. He finished the final character and held the general's gaze, his expression devoid of any warmth. The poem hung in the air, a verbal blade that sliced through the general's composure. Eulji watched as the words took root, observing the minute twitch in the general's cheek and the way his fingers began to whiten against the table's edge. The mockery was absolute, a calculated insult that stripped away the veneer of military protocol. He had come to plant the seed of a ruinous, blinding rage. The general's face contorted, the skin pulling tight across his cheekbones as blood rushed to the surface. His mouth opened, then snapped shut, teeth grinding together with a sound audible in the sudden quiet. His right hand, white-knuckled and trembling, clamped down on the sword hilt until the leather groaned. He leaned forward, his torso straining against the table, his eyes wide and bloodshot, fixed on Eulji with a predatory intensity. Every muscle in his neck stood out like corded rope. He was a man pushed to the absolute edge of his discipline, the sheer audacity of Eulji, standing there with hands relaxed and posture unbothered, acted as a physical barrier. The general's breath came in ragged, uneven gasps, his chest heaving. He stared at the man who had just dismantled his pride, Yu's jaw pulsed, his gaze burning, yet his blade remained in its scabbard, held fast by the crushing pressure of the moment. Eulji did not blink. He held the general's gaze for one final, agonizing second, letting the silence stretch until it felt brittle. Then, with a slow, measured motion, he released his posture. He turned his back on the weapon, on the rage, and on the man, who was still vibrating with the urge to kill. Every step Eulji took toward the tent flap was deliberate, his boots crunching softly on the packed earth. He felt the heat of the general's stare burning into his spine, a silent demand for him to stop, to turn, to fight. He did not grant the request. He reached the heavy fabric of the entrance and paused, his hand resting on the rough weave. He did not look back, yet he knew the general was still frozen, his hand still locked on his sword. Eulji pulled the flap aside and stepped out into the open air of the camp. The transition was sharp. Outside, the camp was a sea of activity, thousands of soldiers moving in the dust, oblivious to the fact that their commander had just been dismantled. Eulji walked forward, his pace steady, his head held high. He moved through the rows of tents like a ghost. He was pulling the enemy closer to the edge of the abyss. The order rippled through the camp like a shockwave. 300,000 men began to move. The earth groaned under the weight of the vanguard, a rhythmic, unending thud of boots that shook the very foundations of the valley floor. They marched with heads held high, their eyes fixed on the horizon, convinced that victory was merely a matter of time. There was no caution in their stride, only the heavy, suffocating arrogance of a force that believed itself unstoppable. The air grew thick with a scent of dust and sweat as the column stretched for miles, a river of iron flowing into the mouth of the valley. Commanders barked orders that were swallowed by the sheer volume of the marching mass. They did not look at the ridges. They did not scan the tree line. They saw only the path forward, a straight line toward a conquest they felt they had already earned. Every mile gained felt like a confirmation of their superiority. The ground beneath them vibrated, a low, constant hum of power that masked the sound of the wind. They were committed now, deep within the throat of the land. Eulji moved with the fluidity of water, always staying just beyond the reach of the vanguard. He led them away from the open plains and into the jagged, broken geography of the northern foothills. The terrain changed, turning from flat, easy ground into a maze of steep inclines and narrow, rocky passes. The Sui soldiers, burdened by their gear and the sheer density of their numbers, found their momentum stalling. Every hour of pursuit forced them to navigate uneven slopes that tore at their formation. Eulji kept his pace steady, never running, never hiding, always visible just over the next ridge. He was a lure, a constant flicker of movement that pulled them further into the wilderness. The sun beat down on the trailing columns, turning the dust into a choking haze that clung to their lungs. They pushed forward, driven by the sight of him. He turned and descended into the shadows, drawing them deeper into the trap. The first clash was brief. Eulji held the ridge for a heartbeat, then signaled the retreat. His men scattered, leaving behind abandoned gear and broken wagons. The Sui vanguard surged forward, cheering. This was the first of 7. At every narrow pass and river crossing, the pattern repeated. Eulji would stand, engage, and then vanish into the mist just as the Sui lines tightened. Each time, he left behind a trail of discarded supplies that looked like a panicked flight. The Sui commanders grew bold. By the 5th encounter, the Sui soldiers were no longer cautious. They were hungry for the kill. On the 7th day, Eulji staged a final chaotic withdrawal near the valley floor. They believed the enemy was broken, fleeing in terror. They did not notice the silence of the birds. The cheers erupted the moment the last of Eulji's men vanished over the ridge. It was a sound of raw, unbridled relief that echoed off the canyon walls. The Sui soldiers dropped their heavy shields and broke rank, swarming the abandoned camp to claim the spoils left in the wake of the retreat. They laughed, clapped each other on the shoulders, and toasted to a victory they believed was already secured. The discipline that had defined their march had evaporated, replaced by a frantic, greedy scramble for the remnants of the enemy. General Eulji Mundeok watched from his horse, his lips curled in a smirk of absolute certainty. He saw the path ahead as a clear road to total conquest. He did not see the tactical error in their scattered formation. He saw only the confirmation of his own genius. The soldiers were no longer a cohesive force of iron. They were a mob of emboldened men chasing a ghost. They shouted insults toward the mountains, daring the enemy to stand and fight. With a sharp wave of his hand, Yu signaled the advance. The army surged forward, abandoning caution for the promise of a final, easy slaughter. They moved with a reckless, heavy gait, their eyes fixed on the horizon, completely unaware that the ground beneath them was no longer a path, but a closing jaw. The momentum of the pursuit carried the Sui deep into the rugged terrain, far beyond the reach of their baggage trains. By the 2nd day of the forced march, the scouts returned to the main column with grim reports. The supply lines had been severed, not by a sudden strike, but by the sheer distance they had covered in their reckless haste. The wagons that should have been trailing behind were nowhere to be seen. The soldiers who had spent the previous night celebrating woke to find their grain sacks empty and their waterskins dry. A low murmur of unease rippled through the ranks as the reality of their isolation took hold. Men who had been shouting for blood only hours before now scanned the barren hillsides. There was nothing but rock and dust. The horses, deprived of fodder, began to slow, their heads hanging low as they struggled against the incline. Hunger started as a dull ache in the gut, then sharpened into a persistent, gnawing distraction. The commanders ordered the march to continue, but the pace had lost its edge. The men moved with a heavy, listless rhythm, their eyes darting to the empty horizon, waiting for a relief that would never come. The arrogance of the chase was being replaced by the cold, hollow reality. The terrain shifted, turning from flat plains to jagged, uneven rock that punished every step. The men were no longer marching, they were dragging their feet through a landscape that seemed to tilt against them. Every movement required a conscious, painful effort. A soldier in the front rank caught his toe on a protruding stone and went down hard, his body hitting the ground with a dull, heavy thud. The line behind him stuttered, men colliding into one another as they struggled to stop. No one helped him up. They simply stepped around the fallen man, their breathing ragged and shallow. The weight of their gear seemed to double with every mile, pulling their shoulders toward the earth. Sweat dried into salt crusts on their faces. The silence of the valley was broken only by the rhythmic, grating sound of boots scraping against gravel and the labored gasps of men. They kept their heads down, staring at the dirt, unable to look at the horizon anymore. The bravado that had fueled the march for weeks vanished, leaving behind a hollow, shivering silence. Men who had once boasted of the coming victory now stared at the ground, their eyes vacant and rimmed with red. A commander rode down the line, his horse barely able to lift its hooves, shouting orders to maintain formation. His voice cracked, thin and brittle against the vast, indifferent wind. No one answered, no one even turned their head. They began to discard anything that added weight, dropping heavy packs and iron tools into the dust. The road was littered with the remnants of their pride. A group of scouts returned, their faces ashen, shaking their heads at the officers. There was no water ahead, there was no grain. The realization hit the ranks like a physical blow, turning their frantic pace into a slow, aimless shuffle. The arrogance of the Sui had been stripped away, replaced by the cold, biting truth of their isolation. Fear finally replaced the heat of their ambition. The path narrowed until it was little more than a jagged crack in the earth. The sky above, once a vast expanse of blue, began to shrink, squeezed out by the rising stone walls on either side. As the column pushed deeper, the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, and the light vanished in an instant. A cold, damp shadow swallowed the valley floor. The temperature plummeted, turning the air sharp and biting against their skin. The soldiers slowed, their footsteps echoing against the sheer rock faces that loomed overhead. They looked up, necks craning, but the ridges were too high, blocking out the horizon and stripping away any sense of direction. The walls were vertical, slick with moisture, and impossible to scale. The space between the cliffs grew tighter, forcing the men to walk in a single cramped line. Every sound was amplified, bouncing off the stone, until the rhythmic shuffling of feet became a deafening roar in their ears. They were no longer walking through a landscape, they were moving through a throat of stone. The path ahead disappeared into the gloom, and for the first time, the men stopped moving altogether, paralyzed by the sheer weight of the rock pressing down on them. A sudden tremor vibrated through the ranks as the rear guard tried to reverse course. The word passed forward like a shockwave. The way back was gone. A massive rockfall had choked the narrow entrance, turning the path into a dead end. Men scrambled toward the rear, pushing against the tide of their own comrades, but the space was too tight, the walls too unforgiving. They were wedged into a corridor of stone that offered no exit. The soldiers at the front stopped, then turned, only to see the same wall of rock and shadow behind them. There was no room to maneuver, no space to deploy, and no path to retreat. The valley had become a natural cage, its floor a narrow strip of dust, and its sides rising like jagged teeth toward the sky. Every attempt to find a gap in the cliffs met with sheer, vertical stone. The realization rippled through the mass, turning their confusion into a frantic, aimless energy. They were trapped in the belly of the mountains, cut off from the world they had marched to conquer. The air grew still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and trapped heat. They looked at the ridges, then at each other, the truth settling into their bones. They were not an army anymore. They were prisoners in a tomb of their own making, waiting for the silence to break. Far above the floor of the gorge, Eulji Mundeok found his vantage point. He moved with the silence of a predator, his boots finding purchase on the loose shale of the ridge. He reached the edge and looked down. From this height, the massive army below appeared as nothing more than a slow, sluggish stream of gray. He watched them drift, their movements erratic and devoid of purpose. They were exhausted, their bodies bent under the weight of the long march. He tracked the way they huddled together, seeking warmth in the cold shadow of the cliffs. There was no order left in their ranks. They were a mass of tired men, aimless and vulnerable. Eulji stood perfectly still, his gaze sweeping across the entire length of the trapped column. He noted the way they looked up at the ridges, their faces pale and strained, searching for a way out that did not exist. He did not move to hide. He waited, his hands resting on the rough stone, his eyes fixed on the center of the valley. The trap was complete, and he was the final piece. Eulji shifted his position, turning his back on the valley to look upstream. There, hidden by a natural bend and dense thickets of pine, lay the true instrument of his design. A massive wall of timber and packed earth spanned the narrowest point of the Sarha River. It was a crude, brutal piece of engineering, built to withstand the relentless push of the current. He walked along the top of the barrier, his feet testing the solidity of the packed mud. The river was not flowing, it was pooling, rising steadily against the wall. He could feel the vibration of the water through the soles of his boots, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that spoke of immense, contained force. Logs groaned under the pressure, their ends biting into the stone banks. He traced the line of the main support beam, a thick trunk buried deep into the bedrock. It held, for now. The water behind the dam was silent, a dark, glassy expanse that had swallowed the natural course of the river. He placed his hand against a support post, feeling the cold, wet wood. The pressure against the timber wall intensified with every passing second. The Sarha River, once a flowing stream, had become a heavy, restless weight, pushing against the makeshift barrier. The water surged, slapping against the upstream side of the logs, its surface churning with trapped energy. Deep within the structure, the timber groaned. It was a low, grinding sound, the wood fibers straining against the relentless force of the current. A single log shifted, its end sliding an inch across the slick bedrock, sending a spray of muddy water into the air. The dam shuddered. The water level continued to climb, creeping higher up the face of the logs, seeking any weakness in the wall. It was a coiled serpent, its muscles bunched and ready to snap. The air around the barrier grew heavy with the scent of wet silt and compressed earth. Every ripple on the surface was a pulse of raw power, a testament to the thousands of tons of water held in check. The barrier bowed, the center beam arching. It was no longer a question of if the wall would hold, but how much longer the earth could contain the fury. The silence of the valley below was about to be shattered. Eulji climbed the steep, jagged ridge that overlooked the valley floor. From this vantage point, the entire landscape lay exposed. He scanned the basin below, his eyes tracking the movement of the Sui columns. They were deep in the gorge, a long winding line of iron and dust that filled the narrow passage from wall to wall. He counted the units, watching the vanguard reach the center of the kill zone while the rear guard was still entering the narrow neck of the valley. There was no room for them to turn, no space to deploy, and no path to retreat. He watched the soldiers stop to rest, their movements sluggish and heavy. They were trapped in the lowest point of the terrain, directly beneath the path of the coming flood. He checked the distance between the lead scouts and the far exit, confirming they were fully committed to the valley floor. Every man, every horse. He looked back toward the dam, then down at the unsuspecting mass of soldiers below. The trap was perfectly set, the valley was silent. A sudden stillness descended upon the valley, sharper than a blade. The wind, which had been whipping through the scrub brush moments ago, simply ceased. It did not fade, it vanished, leaving the air stagnant and thick. The birds that had been circling the high crags banked hard and vanished toward the horizon, their cries cut off as if by a physical barrier. Even the insects, the constant drone of the summer heat, went mute. The silence was not empty, it was heavy, pressing against the eardrums like a physical weight. Down on the valley floor, the rhythmic clatter of equipment and the shuffling of feet seemed to lose its resonance, swallowed by the sudden void of sound. The trees stood frozen, not a single leaf shivering in the dead air. It was as if the valley itself had stopped breathing, holding its lungs full in anticipation of a strike. The water in the riverbed, usually a bubbling companion to the march, turned glassy and still. Every soldier in the basin paused, heads turning, searching for the source. The silence deepened, turning the valley into a tomb before the first drop of water even fell. It was the quiet that precedes a lightning strike. The confusion began as a ripple, moving from the scouts at the front to the exhausted infantry trailing behind. Men stopped mid-stride, their hands hovering over their weapons as they scanned the empty ridges. They called out to one another, but their voices sounded thin and hollow, failing to carry across the stagnant air. A sergeant shoved his way through a cluster of men, demanding order, but he found his own subordinates staring at the sky with vacant, searching eyes. The horses were worse. They tossed their heads and stamped their hooves, refusing to move forward into the unnatural void. Some soldiers dropped their heavy packs, the thud of leather hitting the dirt sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. They began to cluster together, seeking the safety of numbers, yet the proximity only fueled the growing dread. The command structure fractured as officers lost their grip on the men, their shouted orders ignored in favor of a primal, rising instinct to flee. Time slowed to a crawl. The frantic energy of the previous minutes drained away, leaving only a hollow, vibrating tension. One by one, the soldiers ceased their movements. They did not drop their weapons, but their grip loosened, their knuckles turning white. A strange, magnetic pull drew their collective gaze upward toward the jagged silhouette of the ridge. There was nothing to see but bare rock and stunted trees, yet the sensation of being watched was absolute. A veteran near the center of the column dropped his shield. The clatter echoed once and then died, swallowed by the immense, expectant void. They stood like statues in a graveyard, their chests rising and falling in shallow, synchronized rhythm. The air grew thin. A few men knelt, their hands pressing into the dry earth, as if trying to anchor themselves against an invisible tide. The silence reached its zenith. A taut wire pulled to the point of snapping as the valley waited for the final, crushing weight to descend. The sound began as a deep subterranean vibration that traveled through the soles of their boots. It was not the rumble of an army, but the groan of the earth itself. Then, the Sarha River, which had been churning steadily against the stones, began to retreat. The water level plummeted with impossible speed, as if the river were being sucked into a void. Within seconds, the current vanished. The white foam that had defined the riverbank dissolved into wet, glistening mud. Where there had been a rushing torrent, there was now only a jagged, exposed scar of rocks and debris. Fish flopped helplessly in the receding pools, their scales flashing in the dim light. The soldiers stood paralyzed, watching the waterline drop until the riverbed was entirely dry. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the wet slapping of mud as the last of the moisture drained away. They looked at the empty channel, then back at the towering banks that now seemed like the walls of a tomb. The trap was no longer a theory. It was a physical reality laid bare. The river had been stolen, and with it, their only path of retreat. They stood on the dry silt, surrounded by the debris of a river that had ceased to exist, waiting for the next sound to break the unnatural quiet. High above the valley floor, a single figure emerged onto the jagged spine of the ridge. Eulji Mundeok stood motionless, his silhouette carved sharply against the gray expanse of the sky. He did not shout, he did not draw a weapon, he simply existed, a solitary point of stillness overlooking the vast, trapped expanse of the Sui army. Thousands of heads tilted upward, their necks straining to catch a glimpse of the man who had orchestrated their ruin. The soldiers tried to shout, to rally, but the words died in their throats. The atmosphere on the ridge was heavy, pressing down with the weight of a mountain. Eulji shifted his weight, his boots crunching against the loose shale. He looked down, his expression unreadable, his focus absolute. Slowly, with the deliberate precision of a master craftsman, he raised his right hand. The movement was agonizingly slow, knowing that the moment it dropped, the world would end. The ridge became the center of the universe, and the man standing upon it held authority. Eulji Mundeok held his hand suspended in the air, the wind whipping his hair across his face. Below him, the Sui commanders stared up, their faces pale, their hands hovering near their hilts in a futile gesture of defiance. They recognized the man on the ridge, and in that recognition, they saw the end of their campaign. Eulji did not look at the horizon. He looked directly at the center of the valley, pinning the enemy leadership with a gaze that carried no malice, only the cold weight of necessity. The silence in the basin was so profound that the distant sound of his own breathing seemed to echo against the canyon walls. He lowered his hand just an inch, his voice cutting through the heavy air with the sharpness of a blade. "Break the dam," he commanded. The words were not shouted, yet they carried across the entire valley, vibrating through the dry riverbed and reaching the ears of every soldier standing in the mud. He did not wait for a response. He did not offer a final warning. With that single icy sentence, he signed the death warrant for 300,000 men. The command hung in the air, a final, irrevocable seal on their fate, as he turned his back to the valley, leaving the soldiers to face the impending roar of the water alone. The command faded into the stone, but the mountain itself began to answer. Deep within the massive obstruction, a low, guttural groan vibrated through the earth. It was not the sound of shifting rock, but the sound of a structure screaming under impossible weight. A hairline fracture appeared near the base, a jagged white scar on the dark surface. Then, another. The crack spread with terrifying speed, spiderwebbing upward in a chaotic, interlocking pattern. From these fissures, thin, pressurized jets of water hissed out, cutting through the air like blades. The ground beneath the dam shuddered. Pebbles danced on the ridge, and the solid rock face began to bulge outward. The stone reached its limit, the internal tension peaking as the final, singular support beam snapped with a sound like a thunderclap. The center of the wall gave way in a blinding spray of pulverized stone and white foam. It did not crumble, it detonated. The barrier vanished, replaced by a churning, opaque wall of water that surged forward with the force of a falling mountain. The river, held captive for so long, reclaimed its path with a roar that shook the very foundation of the canyon. Trees lining the banks were snapped like dry twigs, swept up into the frothing chaos as the flood front hit the valley floor. The impact was instantaneous. A massive wave, 10 meters high, slammed into the mud, obliterating the ground where the soldiers stood. There was no time for movement or realization. The water hit with the weight of a hammer, churning the earth into a liquid grave. Boulders the size of houses were tossed aside, tumbling through the current like pebbles in a stream. The valley floor, once a dry expanse of dust and waiting, became a churning abyss of silt and debris. The river had become the final, absolute arbiter. The roar was absolute. It was a physical weight, a wall of sound that pressed against the eardrums until they throbbed. Every human cry, every desperate shout, every clatter of metal was instantly swallowed by the thunderous, grinding percussion of the flood. The valley had ceased to be a place of war. It was now a churning, liquid abyss. Water and earth mixed into a thick, swirling slurry that moved with a life of its own, devouring the ground. The sound was not merely loud, it was a constant, low-frequency vibration that rattled the teeth and blurred the vision. Within this deafening chaos, the distinction between land and river vanished. The flood surged, a relentless, roaring tide. There was no silence, no pause, only the endless, hollow boom of the water against the stone walls. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the deluge, leaving nothing but the sound of the abyss. The vanguard was the first to meet the surge. They did not stand a chance. The wall of water struck the front lines with the velocity of a landslide, turning the ironclad ranks into nothing more than debris. Men were lifted from their feet, tossed like dry leaves into the churning vortex. There was no formation left to hold. The water tore through the center of the column, snapping spears and crushing shields as if they were made of parchment. The front line simply ceased to exist, replaced by a frothing mass of silt and broken bodies. Those in the second and third rows had only a heartbeat to register the collapse before the torrent reached them. They were swept off the valley floor, dragged under by the sheer weight of the current. The iron arrogance of the Sui dissolved in seconds. The valley floor was scoured clean. Where a massive army had marched moments before, there was now only the relentless, hungry advance of the river. Panic broke the remaining ranks. Soldiers turned away from the center of the valley, eyes fixed on the steep, rocky slopes that promised safety. They scrambled, fingers clawing at the loose shale and wet earth, desperate to find a foothold above the rising surge. But the ground was failing. The water had seeped deep into the soil, turning the valley walls into a slick, unstable mass. As the first men reached for the higher ledges, the earth gave way beneath them. They slid backward, tumbling into the frothing brown water. The scramble became a frantic, disorganized crush. Men pushed against each other, desperate to climb higher, only to knock their comrades into the path of the flood. The mud was a trap, soft and yielding, pulling at their boots and refusing to let go. Every attempt to gain height only accelerated their descent. The water rose with terrifying speed, licking at the ankles of those still struggling to find purchase. There was no high ground left. The valley floor was gone, and now the walls themselves were being pulled into the churning, muddy grave. The weight was the final betrayal. Every soldier who had survived the initial impact now found himself fighting a losing battle against his own burden. The heavy plates and interlocking links, designed to deflect arrows and blades, became a leaden anchor in the deep, turbulent water. They fought to keep their heads above the surface, but the current was relentless. With every desperate kick, the metal dragged them deeper. Men reached out, fingers grasping at the air, only to be pulled down by the sheer mass of the steel they carried. The water filled their lungs, heavy and thick with silt. They could not shed the weight. The straps were tight, the buckles locked, binding them to their doom. One by one, the struggling figures slipped beneath the brown, churning surface. There was no buoyancy, only the cold, unyielding pull of the riverbed. The surface grew quiet as the last of the desperate thrashing ceased. Below, the valley floor became a graveyard of iron, where the pride of the Sui Dynasty lay pinned to the mud. The river did not care for their rank or their strength. It simply held them down, pinning them in the dark, silent depths until the last spark of movement faded into the silt. The valley was a throat, and the river was the fist that choked it. For a few frantic seconds, the air was filled with the sound of thousands screaming in unison, a jagged, desperate chorus that rose above the roar of the flood. Then, the water surged with renewed violence. It slammed into the remaining pockets of soldiers, hitting with the force of a falling mountain. The sound was cut off instantly. It was not a fade, but a brutal, sudden erasure. The water surged over the last standing men, filling the gaps between them, and crushing their lungs under the sheer pressure of the deluge. Where there had been movement, there was now only the rhythmic, heavy thud of water against stone. The surface of the river smoothed out, no longer churning with the bodies of the dying. It became a flat, brown sheet, indifferent and cold. The screams were gone, replaced by the low, steady hum of the current moving over a tomb. The valley floor, once a path for an army, was now a deep, submerged basin. Silence reclaimed the space, heavy and absolute. The wind blew across the surface, undisturbed by the thousands of lives extinguished beneath. The river eventually slowed, its surface calm once more. The valley was transformed into a vast, sodden basin of debris and silt. From the thick gray mud along the banks, movement flickered. A few figures crawled out, their movements jagged and weak. They were the remnants of an empire, the only ones to escape the crushing weight of the flood. They did not stand. They collapsed onto the wet earth, gasping for air that felt thin and cold. A count revealed the truth. Only 2,700 men remained from the hundreds of thousands who had marched with such arrogance. Their gear was twisted, their weapons lost to the depths, and their will to fight had been washed away by the Sarha. They looked back at the water, which now served as a massive, liquid tomb for their brothers in arms. The silence of the valley was no longer eerie. It was final. The Sui Dynasty had poured its strength into this valley, and the valley had consumed it. There would be no regrouping, no counterattack, and no return. The survivors stared into the mist, knowing they were the last witnesses to a total, absolute defeat. The era of the Sui was finished, leaving behind only the mud. Time eroded the memory of the flood, turning the horror of the valley into legend. Years later, the weight of decades pressed into the joints of Eulji Mundeok as he climbed the weathered stones of the Great Wall. His breath came in shallow, ragged bursts, but his gaze remained sharp, fixed on the distant horizon, where the Tang dynasty began to stir. He reached the summit and found a young warrior waiting. The youth stood with a restless, coiled intensity, his eyes scanning the northern peaks. Eulji stopped, his boots grinding against the grit of the wall. He reached into his pack and pulled out a heavy, rolled scroll. He pressed it into the young man's hands, his grip firm and steady. "The era of the Sui is dust," Eulji whispered, his voice raspy but clear. He pointed toward the mountains, where the wind carried the scent of coming conflict. "Now the era of the tiger begins." The young warrior took the scroll, his fingers tightening around the parchment. Eulji did not wait for a reply. He turned and walked away, his frame slowly dissolving into the thick gray mist that clung to the stone battlements. He left the future in the hands of the boy who would define the next age. The mist deepened, curling around the jagged stones of the wall like a shroud. It obscured the path ahead, turning the world into a blur of gray and white. Eulji was gone, leaving behind only the silence of the high peaks. The wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the masonry, a low, mournful sound that echoed the history of the region. Below, the valley remained, scarred by the events of the past, now slowly being reclaimed by the wild growth of the plains. The sun dipped lower, casting long, thin shadows that stretched across the earth, marking the passage of another day, another year, and another age. The young warrior stood motionless, his gaze still locked on the horizon, where the new power gathered strength. He did not move as the light faded. The mountains stood as they always had, indifferent to the rise of kings or the fall of dynasties. They were the silent observers of every battle, every victory, and every defeat. As the last sliver of daylight vanished behind the northern peaks, the world went quiet. The era of the tiger had begun, and the past was nothing more than a whisper carried away. The wind finally died down, leaving the high ridges in absolute stillness. Where the voices of commanders once echoed, only the shifting of loose shale remained. The air grew thin and cold, biting at the exposed stone of the fortifications. Far below, the river wound its way through the valley, a silver thread indifferent to the blood. Nature had long since scrubbed the evidence of the slaughter from the silt and the grass. The clouds parted for a brief moment, revealing the jagged silhouette of the northern peaks. These heights had watched the rise of the Sui and would watch the coming of the Tang. They were the true keepers of the land, unyielding and silent. The young warrior had long since vanished into the shadows of the interior, leaving the wall to its own devices. No footsteps disturbed the dust, no flags snapped in the breeze. The cycle of power had turned again, as predictable as the seasons, yet as final as the setting sun. The landscape held its breath, waiting for the next storm. Everything was quiet. The mountains remained, watching the horizon, waiting for the dawn of a new age that had already begun. Darkness claimed the horizon, swallowing the last traces of the path. The stars emerged, cold and distant, mirroring the indifference of the ages. What was once a battlefield of immense scale had become a quiet expanse of earth, reclaimed by the slow, relentless march of time. The names of emperors and generals faded like smoke in the night, leaving only the geography to tell the story of what had transpired. Every stone in the wall held a memory of the struggle, yet none could speak of the men who had bled to place them there. The cycle of rise and fall was complete. Another dynasty would claim the plains, another army would march, and another leader would seek to define the era. But the mountains did not care for the shifting borders or the transient pride of men. They remained fixed, silent, and eternal. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and coming snow from the north. It was the breath of a new age, cold and sharp. The world stood poised, silent and expectant, as the long night deepened over the land, marking the true end of the old world and the quiet, inevitable arrival of the next. Time moved forward, indifferent to the empires that had crumbled into the dust of the plains. The stones of the wall, once symbols of defiance, now stood as weathered monuments to a forgotten conflict. Moss crept into the crevices, slowly reclaiming the masonry, softening the sharp edges of human ambition. Below the ridge, the river continued its steady, rhythmic flow, carving deeper channels into the valley floor. It carried no memory of the dam, no echo of the screams, only the silt of the mountains. The history of the Sui had dissolved into the soil, becoming part of the earth that supported the growth of new forests and the migration of wild herds. No monument marked the spot where the tide of iron had turned back. No inscription recorded the name of the man who had stood against the storm. The silence of the landscape was absolute, a heavy, peaceful shroud that covered the scars of the past. The sun rose and set, casting long shadows that stretched across the valley, measuring the passage of centuries in the blink of an eye. The era of the tiger had long since passed. The echoes of the past have finally settled into the bedrock of the Central Plains. What remains is not the clash of steel, or the weight of crowns, but the enduring stillness of the mountains that watched it all unfold. The names that once shook the foundations of empires are now merely whispers in the tall grass, carried by the wind across the valley. History is a relentless tide, yet it leaves behind fragments of truth that persist long after the actors have departed the stage. The lessons learned in the heat of the conflict, the strategies forged in desperation, and the courage displayed in the face of impossible odds, have all been woven into the fabric of the land. There is no more to be said. The struggle has ceased, the dust has settled, and the earth has reclaimed its own. The story of the Sui and the rise of the tiger is complete, leaving behind a legacy that transcends time. As the light fades completely, the landscape stands as the only true witness. It is a quiet, final rest. The cycle is closed. The land remains. The horizon is empty now. No banners flutter in the mountain passes, and no armies stir the dust of the plains. The path that once felt the weight of marching thousands is overgrown, reclaimed by the persistent reach of wild grasses and creeping vines. The wind moves through the valley, but it carries no names, no commands, and no echoes of the past. It is simply air, passing over stone and soil. Every detail that once defined the conflict has been smoothed away by the slow, grinding work of the seasons. The memory of the dam, the river, and the men who fought for their place in history has dissolved into the bedrock. There is nothing left to resolve. The narrative has reached its absolute boundary, where the story ends and the world simply continues. The sun dips below the jagged peaks, casting a final cooling shadow over the valley floor. The light retreats, leaving the land to the coming night. Everything is quiet. The cycle of rise and fall has ceased, leaving behind only the vast, indifferent expanse of the earth. The silence is complete. The history of the Sui, the tiger, and the struggle for the plains is gone. There is only the present, vast and still, waiting for nothing at all. The last trace of the story has faded into the cooling earth. Where once there was the thunder of a collapsing river and the clash of iron, there is now only the rhythmic pulse of the night. The stars emerge over the Taihang Mountains, indifferent to the empires that rose and fell beneath them. Time has done its work, eroding the memory of the conflict until only the geography remains. The valley floor is dark, the riverbed dry and silent, holding no secrets of the past. No echoes linger in the mountain passes. The wind shifts, moving across the plains without purpose or direction. Every action, every decision, and every life that defined the age has been absorbed into the soil. The cycle of human ambition has reached its natural limit, leaving the land to exist in its own quiet, eternal state. There is no more to observe. The narrative arc has collapsed into a single point of stillness. The darkness is absolute, covering the mountains and the plains alike. The history of the tiger and the dynasty is finished. The world is at rest, waiting for nothing. The silence is the final word. The story is gone, leaving only the vast, empty expanse of the earth under the cold, unblinking light of the night sky. The last trace of the story has faded into the cooling earth. Where once there was the thunder of a collapsing river and the clash of iron, there is now only the rhythmic pulse of the night. The stars emerge over the Taihang Mountains, indifferent to the empires that rose and fell beneath them. Time has done its work, eroding the memory of the conflict until only the geography remains. The valley floor is dark, the riverbed dry and silent, holding no secrets of the past. No echoes linger in the mountain passes. The wind shifts, moving across the plains without purpose or direction. Every action, every decision, and every life that defined the age has been absorbed into the soil. The cycle of human ambition has reached its natural limit, leaving the land to exist in its own quiet, eternal state. There is no more to observe. The narrative arc has collapsed into a single point of stillness. The darkness is absolute, covering the mountains and the plains alike. The history of the tiger and the dynasty is finished. The world is at rest, waiting for nothing. The silence is the final word. The story is gone, leaving only the vast empty expanse of the earth under the cold, unblinking light of the night sky. The horizon has leveled out. The mountains that once watched the movement of armies now stand as silent, jagged teeth against a fading sky. There is no movement left in the valleys. The dust of the past has settled into the deep crevices of the earth, indistinguishable from the stone itself. Every footprint has been smoothed away by the slow, relentless friction of the seasons. The rivers have carved new paths, ignoring the memory of the dams. What was once a stage for power is now merely ground. The air is thin and cold, carrying no sound of commands or the clash of steel. The cycle of the tiger and the dynasty has been fully integrated into the bedrock. There is no legacy left to track, only the vast, indifferent expanse. The sun dips below the edge of the world, casting long shadows that eventually dissolve into a uniform, velvet black. The earth does not remember the names of the men who walked upon it. It does not hold the weight of their ambitions. It simply exists, vast and unyielding, beneath the indifferent rotation of the stars. The story has reached its final, silent conclusion. There is nothing left to say. The final echoes have been absorbed by the mountain stone. There is no longer any distinction between the path of the warrior and the path of the wind. The earth has reclaimed the memory of the struggle, smoothing the ridges and filling the hollows with the quiet weight of time. The sky above remains vast and unblinking, casting a pale, cold light over the plains that once trembled under the weight of armies. Every name, every command, and every act of defiance has dissolved into the stillness of the terrain. The rivers flow according to their own ancient logic, indifferent to the dams or the blood that once stained their banks. The cycle has closed. The era of the tiger is not a record, but a shadow that has finally receded into the dark. There is no legacy to be found in the silence of the valley. The stars rotate in their fixed, silent orbits, watching over a world that has forgotten the sound of human ambition. The horizon is empty. The conflict is over. The landscape stands alone, stripped of its history, existing in a state of absolute, undisturbed peace. Only the cold, silent air remains. The last trace of light retreats from the highest peak. The world is now a canvas of shadow, stripped of depth and distance. No breath disturbs the stillness. No pulse beats against the silence. The memory of the river, the wall, and the men has ceased to exist. There is only the dark, heavy weight of the mountain range, unmoving and unobserved. The cycle of seasons continues. The wind moves through the empty passes, carrying nothing, touching nothing. It is a hollow sound that finds no echo. The history of the tiger, the dynasty, and the war has dissolved into the fundamental cold of the night. Every detail is gone. Every action is erased. The earth remains, but it is a world without a story. The final flicker of awareness vanishes. Everything has come to rest. The silence is absolute. The end is here.